Welcome to episode 5 of Road Ready. We're going to discuss gasoline and gasoline choices. In this critical time historically, in terms of fuel costs and our awareness of the finite resource that fossil fuels represent, we're going to talk about fuel. In the summer of 1963, I had my first real job. I was 14 years old and pumping gas at a Hancock gasoline station in Gardnerville, Nevada. We had a gasoline war that summer, as they referred to it in those days, and the price on gasoline fell to just under 20 cents a gallon for regular. The Hancock fuels offered blends between regular, which today would be like unleaded, and premium fuel, which was 101 octane. The regular fuel in those days had enough lead content to have 94 octane rating. The difference being lead, which of course was a toxic and hazardous substance that eventually needed to come out of gasoline. Post-war engines and engines all the way through the muscle car era were engineered to run on high lead fuel, and that would have been octane ratings of 100 to 104 or even higher in the case of fuels like Custom Supreme available from Chevron. After those years of getting exposure to leaded fuel, society moved to unleaded fuels, and high octane became 91 rather than 101 to 104, and regular fuel dropped down to 87 octane. Modern engines are designed for the most part to run on fuel as low as 87 octane, and there are reasons why these engines will tolerate those low octane ratings. Some of the compression ratios in contemporary engines are as high or even higher than some of the muscle cars of the 1960s, yet they tolerate these lower octane fuels. The reason for tolerance of lower octane fuels is simple. Modern engines have electronically managed fuel and spark systems that can retard ignition timing to prevent ping or damaging detonation, or worse yet, pre-ignition in engines. Severe carbon buildup is almost unheard of in modern engines, and yet in the days that I'm talking about, prior to electronic fuel and spark management, carbureted engines could periodically build up enough carbon to require an engine rebuild. So with all of us conscious of fuel costs, is it okay to run 87 octane fuel in any engine? To be clear, most engines have NOx sensors or some means for knowing whether the engine is actually detonating or pinging. In such cases, the ignition timing gets retarded and it compensates for the lower octane fuel. As early as the late 1980s, when I road tested the Corvette ZR1 for Corvette Fever magazine, engines like the LT5 were capable of running on lower than 91 octane fuel, strictly due to the fuel and spark management system and a NOx sensor that engine had. When I tested those engines and drove those cars to see what their performance potential was, it was my policy to run 91 or 92 octane pump fuel in the vehicle for those tests. Why did I do that? Because with that higher octane fuel, the engine fuel and spark management system was capable of advancing ignition timing, and advanced ignition timing produces more horsepower. When you reduce timing, you reduce horsepower. If you run a high performance engine on lower octane fuel, and if it has a NOx sensor to compensate for pre-ignition or ping, you will be reducing the horsepower output of that engine because the ignition timing gets retarded in the process. So as a rule of thumb, higher compression engines require higher octane fuel to develop best horsepower and performance. By putting lower octane fuel in the tank, the horsepower drops and so does the fuel efficiency. So where you may be saving money on the fuel, you may also be losing mileage due to the lack of performance. Are there cases where you can run lower octane fuel in a high compression engine and get away with it? Yes, there are, and I'll give you a clear example. If I'm driving over the Rubicon Trail and going up over 8,000 feet elevation, or even where we live east of Reno, Nevada at over 4,000 feet of elevation, the relative drop in compression due to that altitude will enable me to run lower octane fuel without the risk of ping or detonation. Of course, you're producing less power because you have the equivalent of a lower compression ratio at altitude, and the only way to offset that would be with turbocharging or supercharging. Our Suburban 4x4s, 1986 being our earliest one, and that was a carbureted engine, we were able to run 87 octane fuel at this elevation with no problem. If we drove down to sea level, whether the engine was carbureted or had EFI, I would raise the octane rating of the fuel to compensate for the increase in compression. This issue is not only less noticeable with electronic fuel and spark engines, it is also seamlessly compensated for, and in the process, most of us are unaware of any difference in running lower and higher octane fuels, especially in an urban or flatland environment. When we come to grades or pull trailers or anything of that nature, especially at lower elevations, higher octane fuel is always in my tank. To this point, I've been talking about octane rating and focused on the octane that has to do with the compression ratio of the engine. There are other things related to fuel that we should also be concerned about. In particular, additives in fuel help reduce buildup of deposits and keep the combustion chamber, valves, upper cylinders, and the piston crowns clean. We recently, in the first 3 episodes, dealt with the issue of running lower octane fuel that did not have additives, that as a result built up white deposits on the spark plugs. And over time, those same deposits develop on the piston crowns, combustion chamber, and the valves. Not only does that reduce performance, it also decreases the longevity of the engine. So, in effect, running fuel without additives can be detrimental to the engine, and this has nothing to do with octane. While many consider additives like Techron or V-Power and so forth from major oil producers to be a gimmick, in effect it's not a gimmick. It is not only anti-knock, but cleansing agent for keeping the upper cylinders cleaner. Alternatives, if you're running cheaper fuel that doesn't have additives in the fuel, would be SeaFoam and off-the-shelf Lucas and other products. And what you need to do there is weigh the cost of those additives per tank against the cost of buying premium fuels that actually contain additives. So is the cheapest place in town the place to buy your fuel? Actually, the fuel is probably the same as the fuels that are used as base stock for higher cost fuels. Those fuels that do not have the additives, even if they're the same base stock or bulk fuel, will not give you the service or protect your engine as the higher cost fuels with additives are capable of doing. So in summing it up, you can make your fuel choices based on cost, but one way or the other you will pay for it. Essentially, using lower octane fuel may lower the performance and fuel efficiency of the engine, and using cheaper fuel without additives may also cause premature wear on spark plugs and other areas of the upper cylinders, including hard parts of the engine like the valves, combustion chambers, piston crowns, and the piston ring areas. Gumming up a set of rings by running fuel without any kind of cleansing is really not practical. Over time, especially if you're going to keep your vehicle for a very long time, which is more or less the objective for a lot of us, requires proper maintenance and the proper choice of gasoline.